Some have written off radio as a form of media that will have a sizable footprint in the future. But the Afrobarometer 2020 survey dismisses this, saying that radio is still the most powerful source of information, reaching more people than any other medium on the continent, and is likely to remain so. With the 10th anniversary of World Radio Day on February 13, that's this Saturday, it's fitting to talk to people behind the mic about their experience in this medium. So my guests today are Shay Ulenga, who's a very well-known DJ and producer at 99 FM, and Levi Ngarune Katire, who's the innovation and station manager at Omaheke Radio, and also chairperson of the Namibia Community Broadcasters Network. And finally today we're doing something just a little bit differently in this edition. We will insert comments from radio personalities and presenters, and so we hope that'll make for a nice and lively discussion. So welcome to you both to this 24th edition of the NMT's Free Speak, in which we talk about all things media. I'm your host, Gwen Lister. Radio has been described as the voice of the voiceless. So I'd be interested to hear both your views on this. Levi from the perspective of community radio and Shay from the commercial radio context. What about you starting us off, Shay?
Gwen, thank you very much for having me on this very powerful platform. As we are speaking now, there's no visuals. All you can hear is audio in our voices.
That's right.
And what we're doing right now is we're sharing information. We are talking and having this conversation about radio that many people don't have the opportunity to have, or they just don't do it.
Right.
But then they come on air, they come and find this conversation there. And that is what radio means when it says it's the voice of the voiceless. It's speaking for people who are not on the mic, who cannot speak, who are sitting in areas where they cannot reach out to a radio station to express themselves. Many times the radio, especially from a commercial point of view, many people think this is all about advertising, it's all about making money, but in between all that advertising and all that music playing, there still needs to be relevant, informative, educational content in order to continue educating our masses, in order to bring new information to the table for them to have access to. So yes, radio still remains, as it always has been, the voice of the voiceless, where we can have conversations that we cannot have in our own homes, but in the studio with experts and discuss all these social ills or all the positive things that also happen in our communities and our society.
Jessica Thomas, Kanaal 7.
Ek glo en vertrou, ons is nie net hier om uit te saai, om omroepers te wees of media te wees nie. Ons moet ook kan luister na wat die mense sê en wat die gemeenskap sê en wat hulle kwel. En ek dink dit is baie belangrik. Ons het 'n oop SMS-lyn waar mense betrokke kan wees met hulle eie opinies en ook uitdagings uitspreek, selfs op sosiale media. En as 'n omroeper, maar ook as media, het ons elkeen die verantwoordelikheid om vir mense inligting te gee wat vir hulle belangrik is.
Great thoughts, thank you very much. Levi, about you?
Yeah, no, I share the same sentiments. And Gwen Lister, thank you so much for inviting us to this wonderful platform.
It's a pleasure.
I've been consistent listener of Free Speak, and ever since the first Free Speak, I was like, man, this is something massive. And also the people behind it makes it even more credible. So yeah, radio being the voice of the voiceless, definitely. This has been one phrase that has actually defined radio ever since the beginning of radio. And this is reality, because in a democratic country, sometimes democracy does not reach up to the most minor person, you know.
Absolutely.
So, and it's not everybody that has a high level of awareness when it comes to their fundamental human rights, when it comes to public information, when it comes to all this, and especially not only information coming from the top to the bottom, but the voice of the voiceless. It's a clear definition of the voice that comes from the bottom to the top. That ordinary community member who shares their story or what they can speak, and they share it with their brother at home who's probably somehow involved in a community radio station. And these guys bring it on air and speak about this on radio. Especially at community radio level, we have seen a lot of impact that ordinary topics have actually had. So radio still remains the voice of the voiceless, and it's going to continue to be that for such a long time.
I think you both summed that up very well. And maybe just to add to that, what you said earlier, the podcast. is something that can be so easily accommodated into the radio format.
Very much.
In terms of content. So I'm hoping you guys are going to use this on your particular radio
Very much.
stations as well.
It's actually airing every Tuesday, mind you, from 6 p.m. on 99 FM. Just
Yeah, we also
If you
aired on
can reach
Omaheke
it.
Radio.
Good to
if you
hear.
can reach it on the internet, please do make sure to
Because
tune
it certainly does give
Yes,
a podcast
absolutely.
a much greater coverage, if you like,
Definitely.
rather than people accessing on SoundCloud, which I think some people are not fully aware you can do. Following up on that, radio is also described as a very powerful medium which celebrates diversity and as a platform for democratic discourse. And you've mentioned that basically, Shay. Does it in fact do that? And if so, how? Talking from a commercial perspective.
In our
Your
current landscape of radio, because there is this lack of educating the community or presenters or producers on how to give these messages for masses to actually understand and take them in, it's quite difficult to really say that that's exactly the job that radio is doing. These days, it seems like you walk into a studio, they need an extra hand or two, or mouth or two for on air, and then boom, you're in there. Because there is also not that line to say, okay, in order to join radio in Namibia, you need to have gone through this, you need to have gotten this diploma or this certificate or this degree. Sure, you can do production, sure, you can edit, but can you present? Can you bring the message across to those? Can you be the voice of the voiceless? Is really the question. And currently, that's not how the situation works in Namibia with radio. Currently, you walk in and you've got some good vibes, you got good energy, you got a good character, your personality is coming through your mouth, and then pop, you are on air, but with no training on how to sell emergency information, on how to give critical information. On commercial stations, I guess it's probably worse, because most of the time they don't expect you to know much, but as long as you can sell the product, then you're game and good to go, which shouldn't be the case, because as radio presenters, we are responsible. We have a very big responsibility towards the people who listen to us, and such a powerful medium needs people who are conscious and who are knowing of what's going on around them, and that's all in order to be able to inform and educate, once again, the next man, the guy on the street, and speak for them.
And I think that's an important point, and I'll come to it a bit later, and that is the youth attraction to not necessarily journalism, but the role of a DJ. But let's leave that for now. Levi, while radio can be very independent and trustworthy sources of information, radio can also be a tool of hate in the wrong hands. And I mean, we know we've got examples from Rwanda and so on, the Hutu Tutsi thing. Any thoughts around maybe looking particularly in the context of Namibia? Any thoughts around how we must be very careful in those kind of areas?
Yeah, this is one thing that I have stretched very much. Also, tying into what Shea was saying earlier in terms of no training and all that, I will always speak on at community radio level. When people are not well trained at the radio station, such attributes can come across. You know, there is such a big loophole in the system, and in terms of regulation and oversight by the regulatory authority and all that.
Good point.
So there is still that thing that somebody establishes a radio station and somehow they have a lot of influence. They have an influence on content. A simple young community journalist who came with no level of education,
Sure.
the fact that they were trained by the radio station, somehow there's a lot of censorship and influence from the people running or owning the radio stations.
And clear agendas.
And
perhaps,
clear
as well.
agendas. You know, we have cases where some radio stations could not give some level of airtime to certain political parties during campaigns.
Right.
And little do they know that this is a direct intervention into what the law actually provides, you know, in terms of broadcasting. So that is there, and it exists a lot, and I think government can actually do better. I don't know how much time we have, but later on I'll also speak to our recommendations that we gave into the Ministry of ICT with regard to community media framework policy that they're actually busy developing.
Right.
And we actually have a strong stand on how community radio should be well framed to do away with such content on radio should not be influenced and censored by anybody. And I think that is very, very important, you know.
Gwen, can I add
Please
on
do.
to what Levi is saying now? that whole access to information bill, radio should be included in that, because that's where you go for information. Nobody should be restricted. Commercial, private or public radio licensee should not be restricted to give information to the public, because that's what you're there for. As a powerful medium, you are there shaping minds and shaping the future of the country. So we should not have restrictions, especially not in our public broadcasters, because that's where the majority of our people go to get information. And it's just unfair that we cut that off from them. It's unfair that people who can make these decisions decide that, no, we're not going to go there, we're not going to touch on that. But yet this is very important information for the public.
So very important, the agenda of ownership, perhaps, in silencing voices, if you like. On the other hand, as Levi pointed out, which we'll get to later as well, the training of journalists, the competencies of the person behind the mic is absolutely critical. Maybe just in tandem with this as well, and it's probably a bit of a repeat of the former question, but somebody once said community radio is not necessarily good and commercial radio not necessarily bad, because there is this perception, because commercial radio, as you said earlier, is driven by advertising to a large extent, community there for the community. Just a brief comment from both of you on that statement.
I come from a community radio station, so
You've had experience of both.
I started at a community radio station, so I was taught at a community radio station, then that's where you tell the stories of the community. But for me, it didn't make sense to leave that story behind at the community radio station. How am I going to broadcast and speak to people if I can't speak about what they go through every day? How will they be able to relate to me? Because radio is a very personal thing. You and I need to feel each other, whether I'm in the studio and you're listening in your car, you need to hear me and I need to hear you. So it's not necessarily good, but it's also not bad. I had to carry this sense of community across to the commercial stations because I felt like they're lacking in speaking for the people. They were lacking in creating content. They were only creating content for their advertisers. And yes, you paid $60,000 this month, so this is what you want us to talk about. But how can we conceptualize and be creatives and producers in the radio industry to create content in line with your advertiser and be able to still sell the product and sell the message at the same time, which is where I think many people and a lot of presenters don't take initiative to do. You need to be able to find the line, be able to merge the two, and then script and produce according to that, and really still make the money, and at the end of the day still be able to give the message. So there is platform on commercial radio station to do that, and even more on commercial on community. But now the community part is like a reverse. It's like
absolutely they need
the
to
community
find the
does
advertising.
exactly. So if we can build community radio stations that can at the same time sell, which I don't think this whole thing of community radio stations not being able to have advertising, that must stop. There's a community there.
Absolutely.
They need things there, and there's a platform for you to advertise on.
Absolutely.
So why not?
Edwin Kamushemo, Omaheke Radio.
People seem to see community radio as a joke, but in fact, community radio plays a very, very crucial or vital role in terms of media dissemination, because we are here to disseminate information to our people. But if advertisers doesn't want to come on board, and so that we can have that money, then it will be very, very, very difficult for us to do the right job in the right time.
And we don't want to go into that now, but I mean, Levi, you'll also be very aware of the Zambian example, where radio is, it's huge. And there are scores, I don't know how many at this point, of radio stations, many of them exactly community-based, who sustain, even out of advertising, if you've lost your goats or something. So innovation is required to really keep them going and sustainable.
Very much. Sometimes we create stereotypes, and we actually don't realize how much those stereotypes actually can foster a certain or create a certain impact on the industry. And that stereotype has actually been created around community radios, that no, community radio is not good, community radio is not this, is not that, And it's one of the things that for the time that I've actually been the chairperson of NCBN, it's one thing that I've said, man, this is something that we need to have a direct agenda of. Community radios needs to be, they need to be a change of perception. And not only should there be a change of perception, it should come with some level of support, So community radios, as bad as they are seen or as much as they are belittled, I think gone are those days. The community radios are starting to position or have started positioning themselves with no resources. and with no direct recognition by government.
Eno Kaumba, the Namibian Digital Broadcasting.
I feel like the Ministry of Information or whatever authority that has power to give money to community radio stations doesn't pump in money in community radio stations so that we don't have this problem.
And again, I mean, we have submitted our recommendations when it comes to the ministry's community media framework that they're busy developing. So we're hoping that things will change. We're hoping that the mindset will change. We're hoping that community radios, like stated earlier, community radios will be allowed to actually make more revenue, or have more revenue streams as well, or increased to some extent.
Just so that they're not totally funded or...
Exactly. Because, at this point in time, the Namibian population itself is already too small.
Yeah.
So it's not lucrative to sell advertisement.
Exactly.
And especially within those little communities where community radios actually exist. Community radios, most of them don't exist in Windhoek where there's a high population.
Right.
They exist in very little population areas. So to sell that to advertisers, it's already very difficult. And then there's that suppression by the framework.
And I think it's important also that, for example, even the business community in Namibia, I always felt as a journalist that they need to be far more conscious of the importance of keeping free speech alive, whether it be in the print format or in radio or whatever. And they can do a lot. Even it doesn't have to be an advertisement per se, but they can offer to sponsor certain programs with no strings attached and do things like that and put their money where their mouths are.
Absolutely.
Because if one day if our voices are silenced, theirs will be silenced too.
Definitely.
But maybe just to pick up on the digital divide, and let me turn to you, Shay. There is a very real digital divide in Africa. We know that. And ordinarily there's a perception that urban audiences gravitate more towards online platforms nowadays, and that sort of rural populations find radio the most appealing medium, maybe because of cost, whatever. Very brief thought on that one.
There certainly is this divide, and it's true. So the excuse is always people don't have access and bandwidth, and they can't pick up the podcasts on their phones because they can't afford that. But there are technology is growing every day. I'm sure there are minds out there who can come up with concepts and ways to create a digital platform for people in rural areas. If we can walk into shops these days and you can just put in your mobile number and there comes something out for you, what says we can't do that and set those towers up for people in rural areas? What says we cannot give access to people to use digital platforms and educate them to perhaps use digital platforms to inform themselves or educate themselves? It always brings me back to the traditional form of radio. I always think that if ever there was an earthquake in Namibia, all the wires would be cut, but you'd have your ever-ready radio ready to serve you where you can get your information. Perhaps teaching people to build more or bringing the digital and the traditional together and how we can make that grow. Africa will still constantly rely on radio in its traditional form. That's unfortunately just where we are, unlike the rest of the world.
Laimi Elago, Radio Wave.
Namibia right now, radio is still one of the most important ways of communicating. I mean, if you just look at the Awambo culture or through our villages, people still receive their most important news via the radio. And what happens, most of our households in Namibia have a radio. They might not have a TV, they might not have access to print media, but they certainly will have access to a radio. They might not have access to a smartphone, but they will definitely have access to a radio. So in this country, radio is still the most basic means of mass communication. But if you look at internationally and the trend, there are still some radio shows that have completely found opportunities to grow, especially in a world of technology.
But if we could work in terms of the more our technology grows, the better we can bring also our traditional media forms to that platform and see if the two can work together or find ways how we can be more innovative and cutting edge in bringing technology to the people. I think that's where it all starts, bringing technology to the people. Yeah. And then they have more access to platforms to get more information. They have more access to platforms to read more, to educate themselves more, to teach their children more and share. I think.
Very good points. And also in terms of popularity, as I said earlier, radio is still increasingly popular. What has changed is not, as I say, the listenership, but really the means of which people are listening to radio. And more, obviously, and that speaks to what Shay just said, mobile is increasingly used for people to use to listen to radio stations rather than their old radio devices, put it that way. Any quick thoughts on that, Levi?
Digital or mobile penetration in Namibia is very, very high.
Right.
But data penetration is very low.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize, because people who are planning for the rollout of this stuff mostly are based in urban setups. So it's easier for them to, on a daily basis, kind of forget or have it at the back of their mind in terms of really switching the focus to rural areas. I think the focus should deliberately be switched to rural areas for data penetration.
Absolutely.
It's possible.
And hopefully government is listening.
Yes.
And know where the priorities lie.
Yes.
Exactly.
I mean,
There's no reason why not.
If Telecom Namibia can actually get up and go install 4G coverage tower in Oshombinde, which is close to 300 kilometers away from Khobabes, even before 4G penetration is in Khobabes well widespread, why can't we actually switch that focus to rural area the same way they did like that? It can happen.
It can happen.
To close the digital gap.
Exactly.
Amen.
No, that's a very good point.
Preach on, sir.
Levi, while I've got you talking, just quickly, let's talk a bit about the actual journalists. If one can always call them that, I'm not sure in some examples. But is enough being put into training journalists for radio, especially community radio? And sort of in tandem with that is because we know there's often issues around pay and so on. Are they getting any kind of union protections? This is maybe if you can speak very briefly to that, and what can be done to improve things, both in sense of training and, of course, just paying them better.
Yeah, I think this is a very important topic that we have to continue talking about this on a daily basis. Journalists in Namibia, I will clearly admit that we are not well trained in that area. We have started doing something a little bit to the capacity that we can in the community media network, strengthening the journalistic skills of those young people at the community radio station. Because, these community radios are rural and not really completely rural, but small town setup. And you would not have somebody, a graduate coming from Windhoek to come and stay in Khobabes to work at a community radio. That can never happen.
Right.
So what we do is we take young people from the community and we train them. These are proportional kind of 1 week kind of trainings, and it's not enough.
Right.
So I think somehow the media itself has not been that enticing, or I don't know how to call it, kind of career line. But the fact that radio stations have the need of that human being, they need to do more. Starting from a public broadcaster, I have a lot of friends in NBC who started from, like Shea stated earlier, okay, you have a good voice, your Shiro is very good, come, go on
air.
Some of them are not graduates,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you understand.
Yeah.
So even when you bring that somebody on board, training, like planned, deliberate kind of training should be done.
Yeah.
But most institutions are not doing
enough anyway.
Yeah, they're not doing enough, including our own community radios as well. What we're doing is still not enough.
Okay. Shay, perhaps just on that score, let me turn to you and say that, even given, look, journalism, wherever it is, paper, print, or radio, has never been the best paying profession. You go there for more than just that. But notwithstanding that, a lot of the youth seem to me to be attracted to radio mainly because they see the fame or notoriety that comes with that, and popular DJs on talk shows attract big audiences, so they're kind of attracted to that, and yet they aren't always journalists themselves. I have heard quite a number of radio presenters who you can hear are not competent when they're handling especially sensitive issues, controversial issues around talk radio. What are your thoughts? What would you say to those youth who are attracted as DJs? That it's more than just a voice on radio, right?
You don't belong there.
Right.
Like I said earlier on, the responsibility that radio stations and radio presenters carry is humongous. You are shaping the minds of listeners who are going to be thinkers, who are going to be contributors to the society in the next 5 to 10 years. And they will learn everything from you that day.
Absolutely.
The thing is like this. We drive in the car with mom every day. Mom listens to one particular station. You as a child, you didn't even realize what's happening, but your mind is being shaped. You fall in love with this personality and you're in there. It's not glamour. Whatever that presenter is doing in those 2 minutes, 30 seconds, they've done trained and self-taught on air for the last 10 years.
Right.
And no, there's no money. There's no protection from the government or any unions. And you don't become a superstar just like that.
No,
for me,
quite.
for instance, I think I struck lucky. I became an MC and a TV presenter because that's kind of like what radio gives you, but you have to have more than just this voice and this spark and personality to be able to carry your skills over into those platforms.
Right.
The point is, and I always say this ever since I joined radio, I want to share experiences that I have been able to be exposed to with my youth that don't have the privileges or the chance to go and see different worlds and learn different cultures. My idea is to bring all that back and teach and educate my peers through the mic, 50,000 all at the same time. That responsibility is huge.
Right.
We need to stop as radio stations just, firstly, when girls walk in, it's like you've got to do this and this because you want to be a radio presenter. Sure. That should not be the case.
No, right.
No, we don't have places and institutions that train and educate. But I think as radio personalities and as people who run radio stations and organizations where we can make a change, it's our responsibility then, if the government is doing nothing, to then come up with a module, a presenter's module for radio.
Absolutely. Why
and
not?
go to UNESCO, get the funds for that, and then go through the country and train the community radio stations, share the knowledge that we have, put that together, and maybe even give that to the institutions which have media courses or which run this, so that we can start building radio presenters. Because like we're saying, if radio is not going to die, then we need to create more Ulengas, more Levis to go on and carry that professionalism, that skill and that knowledge with the rest of the world.
And it's very clear that's what's in your genes and in your family genes, Shay, as we speak. Radio in Africa, we all know, has definitely come a long way since 1988, when governments dominated the broadcast sector. Yeah. There have been what some would describe as a renaissance of radio, given the opening up in the airwaves on many African countries, and of course, the alternatives it has given to people to state radio. And of course, it's just the penetration is amazing because of the number of languages that radio happens in. And it doesn't require hugely high levels of literacy to listen to radio either. But for all of this, state-controlled radio, and of course very few of those state-controlled radios, including in our own country, have transitioned to public broadcasting, but they mostly still command the biggest audiences in Southern Africa, as opposed to community and commercial. Some quick thoughts on this.
Yeah, and that will still be the case.
Why is that though, Levi? Why is it?
Because of a source of revenue. If you have a public broadcaster that has actually transitioned or somehow redefined itself from a state broadcaster to a public broadcaster, but still 80 to 90% of the revenue comes from that very government. Yeah, it's obvious what will happen to it, and also puts them in a position where they actually dominate the airwaves because because of the frequencies that they have. In Namibia, we have the infrastructure sharing policy that when you go to our state broadcaster today, you actually granted a quotation as to how much you must pay, while the infrastructure sharing policy says different.
Yes.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah.
So I think there's so many loopholes that exist that should be relooked so that we can actually balance. I mean, there was a year when the Minister of ICT, not the current one, but previous one, I want to put names, but yeah, so we're saying so much on World Radio Day, I remember very well, and he kept talking about community radio stations. And afterwards, I had an interview with him, and I said, but Honorable Minister, you speak so much highly of community radio stations on days like this. On an ongoing basis, the preference is actually one side.
Exactly.
And that also influences the penetration towards the listeners as well.
Right.
Or other radio stations are actually overpowered and overcrowded by the public broadcasters because of the preference that they get. So something should change.
Right.
Yeah.
And never mind, constant bailouts of the state broadcaster, money which could have been
I thought you said,
much well spent.
I thought you said you never mind.
Community sector.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that as well. But also, I think it was Franz Kruger of the Wits Radio Academy who said that while radio is Africa's most important source of information, at the same time, a lot of the content is news, some of it culled from print media, and music. So I want to ask you both, but literally just very quickly, whether investigative reporting can be enhanced in a radio format. We all know that it's normally print media that does the investigation. Or how can we reach the next level where radio really and truly empowers and informs by incorporating this type of journalism? And again, especially with regard to that rural scenario where people often miss out.
Yes. I want to go very quick as well on that one. So when you don't have protection, you don't feel protected. It's also difficult. So I think there needs to be some change in the framework, or the journalists need to reorganize themselves and push through this journalists union so that they can be much more protected.
Right.
Absolutely. I agree with Libby, and I would like to just add a little bit something. I believe that journalism is journalism, whether it's for broadcast, whether it's for print. The same process for investigative journalism works for radio as it does for print. The only difference is you are producing the one for audio and you're producing the other one for print, and a few things might be different, but the story, if it's still the same and there still needs to be information and answers given to the people who are listening, then you still need to go and investigate that. It's just the lack of the legislation not being able to take care of journalists, not being able to, being censored. I mean, you can't go and talk to the minister because last time they sponsored us this, and now you're taking the money out. There's no such thing. So what am my ethics as a journalist? What's the deal then? Where do you put me? The station does not protect you. Who's going to protect you? So we need to vigorously, through that journalists union, work on the rules and the regulations that have been put in place for practicing journalism in Namibia. How could you censor us? We are the voice of the voiceless, and people need to hear this information. So open the doors. Let radio DJs learn how to investigate. Wherever they're going to go do media studies, teach them how to journalistically investigate for radio or create the content. But we have to. It's time that we do, because we keep on failing the people each and every single day from 6 to 6 on air, and we're just there giving like nothing. There's just nothing, air coming out, but there's no sustainable information, some real genuine things. There's like situations on our table right now as a country that need radio journalism.
Maria Namupala, Shipi FM.
Ngere uri omtori mpundana, ounuku karatoganja uirere uri pesimbo, wakorekwa, nashi noto shininga shike unandono tokongo uirere aujeko sosa zoe, opashike ukaru shikucha shitoganja nenge omombepo nengo toshanga mehokoro njono toganja opare shiwe nenge apurakeni, yakarena einekiro mungwe kucha uirere aujeto ganja uri simbo wakorekwa uri monjira.
We sit on serious issues because we are afraid, and we don't have journalistic protection, and we don't have journalistic trainings. I'm coming from Omaheke. Omaheke has been in making headlines the past almost 3-4 years.
And whose responsibility is it now to bring that?
But the young people at the stations are afraid to talk about these issues. They don't feel protected. They don't have the know-how of doing real investigative stuff. I think the need is very, very high.
And I think it's very important. I agree with both of you on that. And I think we, even as journalists, wherever we find ourselves, as you say, whether it's online, whether it's print, whether it's radio, we must stop thinking in silos.
Yes.
Because we do. The print journalists all gather together and think radio journalists are just DJs. And so, also to training institutions that in future, I often see that they will have a training workshop for print journalists on data journalism or whatever, but we should merge it all together. We're all doing the same job. It's simply the format and perhaps technical things that are different.
It's just a translation from the print to the audio.
So perhaps that's something to take away going further.
Absolutely.
But I'm going to have to come to my final question, guys.
Before you do, Gwen, I just want to say, DJs, the disc jockeys,
Mm.
radio jocks, RJs. Those are that's us, okay? And then radio journalists. That's. I just like everybody's like, Shay, you're a DJ. No.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, that's
but
a very
yes,
good point.
yeah.
Thank you, Shay. So we all know that more and more African audiences are moving online. The big question for radio, like newspapers, is how to keep or maintain the public attention and trust, even more importantly. So I'd like a few thoughts from you both on that. At the same time, acknowledging this Saturday is World Radio Day, February 13th, and a few final celebratory thoughts from you both to conclude this podcast. Levi, you.
I'm going to speak more on World Radio Day and why it's really, really important. Even in this pandemic, it's also important. I think radio should be celebrated. I like topics or the themes around innovation and radio still evolving. So I think everybody should be celebrating World Radio Day. I think we have done quite an okay job in Namibia celebrating World Radio Day the past few years. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, this year I think World Press Freedom Day is also being celebrated in Namibia, right?
Right, it is.
So
yes,
I mean, this should be a build up to that main event. Radio, I always say, we have to think of it as storytelling.
Good, thank you, Levi. Last word, Shay.
Obviously, radio over the last few years has transitioned to online. It's created many online radios. There's so many podcasts going on. But I think traditional radio should find ways of including those digital platforms into their traditional platforms. Sure. For instance, the NMT podcast playing out on 99 FM. I mean, that's a recent partnership.
Right.
And there's just so much that comes from it. Like, seriously, it doesn't have to be a podcast lingering on the website there by itself. It can be empowered by radio. Absolutely. And of course, online radio platforms, the Cliff Central has shown that you can do it. And it's just a matter of moving from the traditional bandwidth on your radio to putting it online, to putting it out there for people to access and listen to in their urban areas and so on. Even if we go through those platforms, the most important thing about radio is to keep it personal. It's when you're speaking one-on-one to someone when they're affected the most. When you're talking to a bunch of people, it feels like you're not talking to me, but keeping it personal, keeping it interactive, and letting the listener know that they are free to engage and talk to you directly. That's where the conversation happens, both at podcasts, both online, and both traditionally. And I believe in radio. I believe that for so many more years, so much more is going to come. And radio is the place to go to get all your answers. We just need to open the doors and unlock those spaces for the truth to come out, number one, and for people to have access to that information. Yeah. You know, like for instance, you give a license, the license is for 5 years. If you haven't done anything with the license, please give it back to CRAN.
Yeah.
So that those who have ideas and want to do this for the people come through and do that. Otherwise, you're blocking us and you're failing the nation at large. So let's have those conversations. It's about time. This is 2021. We can't live in the past anymore. We've got to forward into commercial.
Thank you, Shay. Yeah. And I mean, to our listeners out there, you can hear both of our guests today, Levi and Shay, the passion there is for radio. And so I'm absolutely sure that a new world, new radio is very, very possible with people like yourselves. Thank you again for joining me for this chat today.
Thank you so much for having us on your conversation.
Thanks.
That was fun.